A man is not truly wise until he understands how little he knows. Charles Dickens. Dickens lived in an age of factories, smoke, debtors' prisons, and child labor. And yet somehow, he was writing about us. He was not interested in events alone, but in patterns, in outcomes, in what happens to human beings when societies organize themselves without care. This audiobook is not a biography, and it is not a literature review. It is an exploration of the human condition through the eyes of a writer who understood it with uncomfortable clarity. Across this journey, we will move through Dickens' major works, Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, Great Expectations, A Christmas Carol, Bleak House, and Hard Times. Not simply to understand their plots, but to understand why they still matter. Why neglected children still become criminals. Why ambition still fails to heal shame. Why systems still erase responsibility. Why progress still outruns conscience. Dickens did not write fantasies. He wrote mirrors. If you've ever felt exhausted by systems that don't see you, if you've ever believed that climbing higher would finally make you whole, if you've ever sensed that society is moving fast, but not wisely, then this audiobook is for you. For your listening experience, we place all ads within the first 20 minutes only, so you can listen uninterrupted for the remainder of the journey. If you find value here, consider liking the video and subscribing to the Infinite Archive. It helps us continue preserving ideas that refuse to expire. Now, settle in. This is not history. This is recognition. Chapter 1. The world Dickens was born into. Charles Dickens was born into noise, not the noise of conversation or community, but the new mechanical roar of the 19th century. Iron grinding against iron, steam hissing through pipes, factories breathing smoke into the sky like living creatures. Cities were swelling at a speed no society had ever experienced before. Streets filled with strangers. Work never slept. Time itself seemed to accelerate. This was a world where movement meant progress and stillness meant falling behind. People no longer lived by seasons or sunlight, but by whistles, bells, and schedules. The city did not pause. It demanded motion, constant, relentless motion. For the first time in history, human life was being reorganized around machines. Before this moment, work had been physical, local, and human-scaled. Now, time was divided, measured, sold. Hours were no longer lived. They were used. A man's value could be calculated. A child's usefulness could be priced. Efficiency became a moral virtue. Speed became a sign of intelligence. Slowness began to look like failure. Life stopped being about meaning and started being about output. This shift wasn't just economic, it was psychological. People learned to think of themselves as units inside a system. Days blurred together. Fatigue became normal. And the question quietly entered society for the first time. What happens to the human soul when life is organized entirely around production? The cities grew faster than compassion did. People arrived in vast numbers, chasing work that barely paid enough to survive. Housing collapsed into overcrowded slums. Disease spread easily. Hunger became common. And children were absorbed into labor as if it were natural. This kind of poverty was new. It wasn't rural hardship or seasonal struggle. It was industrial poverty, permanent, impersonal, and invisible to those who benefited from it. Suffering happened in plain sight, yet somehow remained unseen. And it was into this world, loud, fast, indifferent, that Charles Dickens opened his eyes. Before industrialization, life had been local. People knew who they depended on, and who depended on them. Factories changed that. Work pulled people away from family, tradition, and place. Villages emptied. Cities swallowed strangers whole. Responsibility became abstract, spread so thin that no one felt accountable anymore. Help was no longer personal. It was outsourced to institutions, and institutions do not feel shame. A new moral divide emerged. On one side were the respectable, clean, employed, orderly. On the other were the poor, increasingly blamed for their condition. Comfort depended on distance. If suffering stayed invisible, it stayed tolerable. Dickens would later notice something chilling. The most dangerous cruelty was not hatred, but indifference disguised as normality. This was a society moving faster than it could reflect. Progress was celebrated, output increased, wealth concentrated, and underneath it all, human cost quietly accumulated. The language of morality had not disappeared. It had simply stopped asking the right questions. It was into this moment, loud, productive, and blind, that a child would grow up who remembered what suffering looked like, and who would spend his life refusing to let society forget. Chapter 2, Dickens the Child. Pain as Perception. Charles Dickens did not begin life at the bottom of society. He was born in 1812 into a family that was respectable, hopeful, and, at least on the surface, secure. His father worked for the Navy Pay Office. His mother came from a cultured family. There were books in the house, conversation, music, theater. This mattered. It meant Dickens's earliest experience of the world was not deprivation, but expectation. The belief that life would move forward, that effort would be rewarded, that one could reasonably imagine a future better than the present. As a child, Dickens read constantly. He wandered through stories, plays, and imagined worlds. He was observant, sensitive, and already quietly absorbing human behavior. For a moment, a brief, fragile moment, the world still made sense. Then the structure gave way. Debt entered the household slowly, and then all at once. Dickens's father lived beyond his means, and Victorian England had little patience for that. Money ran out. Respectability evaporated. The family fell, not in drama, but in shame. This was Dickens's first encounter with a brutal truth. Society does not care how quickly you fall, only that you have fallen. Status changed how people looked at them, how doors opened or didn't, how dignity quietly disappeared. For a child who had known security, the descent was disorienting. There was no gradual adjustment. One world ended and another replaced it. and Dickens learned something that would stay with him forever. Comfort is conditional. At 12 years old, Charles Dickens was sent to work, not as an apprenticeship, not as education, but as necessity. He was placed in a blacking factory near the Thames, pasting labels onto bottles of shoe polish. The work was repetitive. The rooms were dirty. The hours were long. Older boys worked beside him, already hardened by circumstances he was only just beginning to understand. This was not labor meant to build character. It was labor meant to keep the family afloat. What marked Dickens most was not exhaustion, but humiliation. He was acutely aware that this was not where a child like him was supposed to be, that something had gone wrong, and that no one seemed particularly concerned. Years later, Dickens would say this experience never left him. It returned in his writing again and again, in forgotten children, neglected boys, and young lives quietly wasted by indifference. While Charles worked, his father was imprisoned. Not for violence, not for theft, but for debt. In Victorian England, owing money was treated as a moral failure. Dickens's father was sent to a debtor's prison, and the family followed him there as they could. Home became fragmented. Authority collapsed. For Charles, this was a profound rupture. The adult who was meant to protect him had been removed by the very system that claimed to uphold order. Responsibility was inverted. The child worked. The father was confined. Dickens learned something essential in this moment. Institutions do not bend for vulnerability. They proceed, regardless of who is crushed beneath them. What stayed with Dickens was not just what happened to him, but what happened around him. Adults complied. Creditors followed procedure. Officials enforced rules. Employers paid just enough to survive. No one appeared cruel in isolation, and yet the outcome was quietly devastating. This was Dickens's first glimpse of a disturbing pattern. Harm does not always come from villains. It often comes from people doing their jobs. The systems worked. The people within them did not intervene. And trust, once broken in childhood, rarely returns whole. Many people experience hardship. Few remember it clearly. Dickens did. He remembered the small details, the sounds of work, the smell of the factory, the way shame settles quietly rather than announcing itself. Suffering did not blur his vision, it sharpened it. Pain became education, not in bitterness, but in awareness. It taught him where society fractures first, and who is asked to bear the cost when it does. This is why Dickens's compassion feels precise rather than sentimental. He was not imagining suffering. He was remembering it. Out of this childhood didn't come resentment. It came something more dangerous. Dickens developed a lifelong intolerance for unnecessary suffering, especially suffering that society preferred not to notice. He could not forget the child left behind while the world continued smoothly onward. This was not anger that shouted. It was anger that watched. It asked why help arrived too late. Why dignity depended on income. Why systems ran efficiently while people broke quietly inside them. Empathy for Dickens was not abstract. It was memory sharpened into purpose. And once that seed was planted, it never stopped growing. It would appear again and again. In orphans, in forgotten children, in ambitious young men damaged by success, and in societies that mistook order for justice. Chapter 3. What Dickens was really writing about. Charles Dickens is often remembered as warm, sentimental, even nostalgic. That memory is incomplete. Dickens did not romanticize suffering. He did not believe hardship made people noble by default, and he did not write to make poverty look beautiful. When he described suffering, it was meant to be uncomfortable. Tears in Dickens are rarely gentle. They accuse. They ask why this pain exists at all. If his stories feel emotional, it is not because he was indulging feeling. It is because he was refusing to look away. At the center of every Dickens novel is a single concern: dignity. Not happiness, not success, but whether a human being is treated as fully human, who is listened to, who is dismissed, who is allowed to fail without being erased. For Dickens, the greatest crime a society could commit was not inequality. It was indifference to humiliation. Once dignity is stripped away, everything else follows. This belief quietly governs all his stories. It is the lens through which every character must be seen. Dickens had a deep suspicion of systems that functioned smoothly, not because organization was evil, but because efficiency often arrived where empathy had left. In his novels, institutions rarely scream. They whisper, they process forms, they follow procedure. And while they do, people suffer quietly inside them. Dickens saw something many missed. Systems can destroy without intention. No villain is required, only distance. This is why his courts, schools, prisons, and offices feel cold. They do not hate, they simply do not care. Dickens did not believe money revealed success. He believed it revealed character. Wealth, in his world, is never the ending. It is the experiment. What happens when a person no longer needs to notice others? What habits surface when comfort removes urgency? Some characters grow generous, others grow blind. Dickens was interested in that divergence. Money does not redeem, it exposes. And in exposing people, it exposes society itself. For Dickens, class was never just economic. It was psychological. Class decided who felt visible and who felt watched, who spoke confidently and who spoke carefully, who belonged and who felt they were borrowing space. Shame moved silently through society, teaching people where they stood without ever saying it aloud. Dickens understood this instinctively. He showed how people internalize judgment, how they begin to police themselves long before anyone else needs to. The deepest wounds in his novels are often invisible. They live inside the characters. Against all of this, Dickens placed one quiet force: compassion. Not charity performed for praise, not pity from above, but attention, the willingness to see another person clearly. In Dickens' world, compassion is what holds society together when systems fail. It restores dignity where rules cannot. It interrupts shame before it hardens. This is why his kind characters feel so important. They are not naive. They are necessary. Without compassion, progress becomes hollow. Dickens could have written essays. He could have delivered arguments, statistics, and speeches. He chose stories. Stories do something arguments cannot. They bypass resistance. They invite identification. When a reader feels sympathy for a character, judgment softens. When a reader recognizes themselves, defenses fall. Dickens understood this instinctively. He wasn't trying to win debates. He was trying to change perception. Stories made suffering personal and therefore unavoidable. Each Dickens novel is a moral experiment. A child placed inside poverty, a young man given sudden wealth, a system allowed to run unchecked, a society that mistakes order for justice. The characters are not abstractions. They are test cases. What happens if ambition outruns empathy? What happens when money arrives without meaning? What happens when institutions forget who they exist for? From this point on, the stories themselves will answer. We are no longer reading plots. We are watching society reveal itself. Chapter 4. Oliver Twist. How Society Creates Its Own Criminals. Oliver Twist enters the world with nothing to protect him. He is born in a workhouse, unnamed, unwanted, and immediately absorbed into a system designed to manage poverty rather than care for it. There is no family history, no inheritance, no social buffer. Even his name is assigned by an official, as if identity itself is administrative. This matters deeply to Dickens. Oliver does not fall into hardship through bad decisions. He does not lose status. He does not decline. He begins at the bottom, not because of who he is, but because of where he is born. From the first pages, Dickens removes the idea of choice. Oliver's life is constrained before he is old enough to understand it. Every rule, every ration, every punishment is decided by others who will never know him personally. Oliver is not written as exceptional because of talent or intelligence. He is ordinary, and that is the point. Dickens is asking a quiet but devastating question. What happens to an ordinary child when society offers no protection at all? Oliver's story is not a journey of growth. It is a journey of transfer. He moves from one institution to another, the workhouse, an apprenticeship, the streets, and eventually the criminal underworld. At no point is he guided. He is processed. Each place claims to serve a purpose. Each claims moral authority. And each, in its own way, fails him. The workhouse starves him in the name of discipline. The apprenticeship treats him as expendable labor. The streets offer danger instead of safety. And the criminal world, for all its darkness, is the first place that actively recruits him. Dickens is careful here. He does not portray Oliver as choosing crime over virtue. He shows a child being passed through systems that narrow his options until only one path remains. Oliver is not shaped by guidance or care. He is shaped by neglect. And through this movement, Dickens makes his larger point clear. society does not merely fail vulnerable people, it moves them toward predictable outcomes. The workhouse in Oliver Twist is not merely a setting, it is a philosophy. It exists under the belief that poverty must be disciplined out of people, that hunger is a moral failure, that comfort would encourage laziness, and so deprivation becomes policy. Dickens exposes this logic by showing how carefully cruelty is justified. Meals are reduced not out of necessity, but principle. Kindness is treated as weakness, and suffering is reframed as education. What makes this especially disturbing is how ordinary it all appears. The officials do not see themselves as villains. They see themselves as responsible men doing difficult work. Procedures are followed, rules are cited, consciences are quieted by paperwork. This is why Dickens calls attention to the performance of morality. The workhouse does not merely punish the poor, it moralizes that punishment, turning deprivation into virtue. In doing so, Dickens identifies one of society's most dangerous habits, the ability to harm people while believing oneself to be righteous. The most famous moment in Oliver Twist is also one of its simplest. Oliver, starving, asks for more food. "Please, sir, I want some more." This request is treated as rebellion. The room freezes. Authority is offended. Punishment follows, not because Oliver has done harm, but because he has exposed need. Dickens is doing something very precise here. He turns hunger into a philosophical test. Oliver's crime is not disobedience, it is visibility. By asking for more, he forces the system to confront the reality it is designed to ignore, that its rules do not sustain life. The response is swift and instructive. Oliver is marked as dangerous. His need is reframed as insolence. Survival itself becomes immoral. This moment condenses Dickens's argument into a single scene. When a society treats need as rebellion, it will inevitably punish the vulnerable for existing. When Oliver is drawn into the world of crime, Dickens is careful not to frame it as temptation. It is recruitment. Fagin's household functions like an institution. The boys are fed, they are sheltered, they are trained, skills are taught, loyalty is enforced. There is structure where none existed before. Dickens's point is not to romanticize this world, it is to expose a brutal comparison. Crime here becomes the only remaining form of education available to abandoned children, where schools fail, where apprenticeships collapse, where charity withdraws, criminal networks step in to fill the vacuum. The artful Dodger and the other boys are not born criminals. They are apprentices. They learn behavior that allows them to survive in the environment society has created for them. Dickens is making a devastating claim. If society refuses to educate, guide, and protect its most vulnerable, it should not be surprised when others do. For their own ends, crime is not chosen freely. It is taught where nothing else is offered. One of Dickens's sharpest reversals in Oliver Twist is his treatment of respectability. The most openly criminal characters are visible, named and condemned. The most destructive figures are clean, polite, and legally protected. Officials, businessmen, and authorities speak the language of order while creating the conditions for suffering. Their hands remain clean because harm is indirect, administered through policy, distance, and denial. Dickens does not suggest that criminals are good. He suggests that respectability often hides responsibility. This is why the novel feels so angry. The system punishes visible crime while excusing invisible cruelty. It condemns theft while tolerating starvation. It enforces rules while ignoring consequences. Dickens' accusation is clear. The true danger to society is not lawlessness at the margins, but moral blindness at the center. And it is precisely that blindness that allows injustice to continue without resistance. Oliver's innocence is often misunderstood. It is not there to suggest purity or saintliness. Dickens does not present Oliver as morally superior. He presents him as unformed. That distinction matters. Oliver is not good because he resists corruption through strength of character. He resists it because he has not yet been shaped by the forces around him. He has not been fully trained by the workhouse, by the streets, or by crime into believing that cruelty is normal. This is Dickens's deeper claim. Corruption is not natural. It is learned. Oliver's innocence acts as a control group. By keeping one child relatively untouched, Dickens shows what happens when brutality is absent, and more importantly, what causes it when it appears. The novel is not asking why Oliver remains innocent. It is asking why so many others do not. And the answer is not nature. It is environment. One of the most unsettling aspects of Oliver Twist is that it lacks a single, central villain. There is no mastermind orchestrating suffering. There is no moment where evil is decisively defeated. Instead, responsibility is distributed. Workhouse officials follow policy. Magistrates enforce law. Criminals exploit opportunity. Bystanders look away. Each actor plays a small, defensible role. Together, they produce devastation. Dickens is making a structural argument. Evil does not require intention when systems are badly designed. When neglect is normalized, when accountability is diluted, and when compassion is optional, suffering becomes predictable, even inevitable. In Oliver Twist, society itself becomes the antagonist, not because it is cruel, but because it is organized in a way that allows cruelty to occur without consequence. Oliver Twist is remembered because it refuses a comforting explanation. It does not blame fate. It does not blame character. It does not blame individual weakness. Instead, Dickens makes a direct accusation. He shows a society that starves children in the name of discipline, abandons them in the name of efficiency, and then condemns them when they learn to survive by any means available. This is why the novel still unsettles. Dickens does not ask the reader to pity Oliver. He asks the reader to look at the structures around him. The question the book leaves behind is not, why did this child fall? It is, why did we build a world where falling was inevitable? That is why Oliver Twist endures. It is Dickens's angriest novel, not because it shouts, but because it exposes a truth that is still uncomfortable to face. A society that creates suffering will eventually create crime, and then punish it. Chapter 5. David Copperfield. How Identity is Forged Through Suffering. David Copperfield is the story of a life, not a single crisis, not a moral lesson, but a boy who grows up, slowly, painfully, into a man. David is born after his father has already died. From the beginning, he enters the world without protection, without authority on his side, and without anyone whose sole job is to safeguard him. The novel follows him from early childhood through adolescence and into adulthood, tracing every major stage of his formation. This book mattered more to Dickens than any other, because it was the closest he ever came to telling his own story. He once called it his favorite child, and that affection shows. David is not an idea, he is lived in. The novel unfolds as a first-person account, written by David himself, looking back on his life. That choice is crucial. This is not just what happened to him. It is how he remembers it, how he understands it, and how he makes sense of becoming who he is. David's childhood begins gently and then fractures. His mother remarries, and the household changes almost immediately. Authority arrives in the form of a stepfather who rules through fear, and a home that once felt warm becomes tense and unpredictable. David is punished not for wrongdoing, but for being inconvenient. His emotions are treated as flaws. His vulnerability becomes something to correct rather than protect. Eventually, he is sent away to school, not as opportunity, but as removal. This pattern repeats throughout his early life. Guardians fail him. Adults who should care for him are either cruel, weak, or absent. Stability never lasts. Safety is always temporary. What Dickens is showing, very deliberately, is how insecurity becomes normal. David does not experience one traumatic event. He experiences a childhood shaped by uncertainty. And from this, something important begins to form. A boy who learns early that he must observe carefully, adapt quickly, and rely on himself long before he is ready. After childhood, David's life becomes a series of departures. He is sent away to different schools, removed from homes, passed between guardians. Later, pushed into work at a young age when money disappears and support collapses. Each move is framed as necessary. Each is explained away by circumstance. And each teaches David the same lesson. Nothing is permanent. He learns how to read rooms quickly, how to sense moods, how to adapt before conflict arrives. Stability becomes something he hopes for, but does not expect. As he grows older, movement turns into self-direction. He leaves bad situations rather than endure them. He walks long distances to find work. He begins to choose motion over stagnation. This is not ambition yet. It is survival. Dickens is careful here. David's restlessness is not presented as weakness. It is the coping strategy of a child who learned early that staying still often meant being hurt. By the time David reaches adulthood, movement has become part of his identity, a way of staying ahead of pain, even when he doesn't yet know what he's moving toward. Throughout David's life, authority repeatedly disappoints him. Teachers humiliate rather than instruct. Guardians protect themselves before protecting him. Adults speak of duty while acting out of convenience or fear. Dickens does not portray authority as evil by default, but as unreliable when it is unearned. Power in David's world often belongs to those least capable of using it wisely. Rules are enforced unevenly. Punishments feel personal. Kindness, when it appears, feels accidental. This shapes David's psychology in subtle ways. He does not rebel openly. He observes, he waits, he learns to distrust structures while still craving approval from them. The result is a young man who is compliant on the surface and cautious underneath. Someone who wants guidance, but no longer fully believes in it. Through David, Dickens is making a broader point. When authority is inconsistent, children grow up learning to manage power rather than respect it. And that lesson stays with them for life. Because the outer world offers David so little safety, he turns inward. As a child, he reads obsessively. Books become companions. Stories become places he can enter and control when his real life feels chaotic. Where authority fails him, imagination steadies him. This is not simple escapism. Dickens shows imagination as a survival skill. Through stories, David learns language, emotion, and possibility. He learns how lives can unfold differently. He rehearses futures before living them. And slowly, without realizing it, he begins to shape an inner identity that is more coherent than his outer circumstances. As David grows older, imagination evolves into ambition. He wants not only to escape suffering, but to make sense of it. He begins to believe that if he can tell his story clearly enough, he might master it. Dickens is laying important groundwork here. David's later career as a writer does not appear suddenly. It grows naturally out of a childhood where inner life had to compensate for outer instability. Imagination becomes the bridge between damage and meaning. When David enters adulthood, he carries his childhood patterns with him, especially into love. He falls hard and early. He idealizes. He confuses admiration with compatibility and affection with safety. His emotional education lags behind his intellectual one. Dickens is unsparing here. David makes poor romantic choices, not because he is foolish, but because he is inexperienced in secure attachment. He is drawn to people who feel familiar, distant, unreliable, or quietly unavailable. These relationships matter because they extend the novel's core question. What happens when a child who lacked stability tries to build intimacy? David learns through error, through disappointment, through the slow recognition that love cannot be built on longing alone. This section of the novel grounds David's growth in realism. Maturity does not arrive through revelation. It arrives through consequence, and Dickens makes his point gently but firmly. Emotional wounds do not disappear when childhood ends. They simply change form. The most important transformation in David Copperfield is not external. It is narrative. As David matures, he begins to look back on his life rather than simply live inside it. He starts to recognize patterns, how fear shaped his choices, how insecurity guided his attachments, how movement became habit. This shift matters more than any job or relationship. By telling his story himself, David reclaims authorship. Events that once felt random begin to make sense. Pain is not erased, but it is placed into sequence. Meaning begins to emerge where there was once only reaction. Dickens is making a subtle but powerful claim. Identity stabilizes when a person can tell their own story truthfully, not heroically, not defensively, but honestly. David does not become strong by denying his past. He becomes whole by understanding it. One of Dickens' most mature insights appears quietly in this novel. damage does not vanish. David does not get over his childhood. The losses, humiliations, and fears continue to influence him, in his caution, in his longing for approval, in his occasional self-doubt. What changes is not the presence of pain, but his relationship to it. Dickens refuses the comforting fantasy that adulthood automatically heals childhood wounds. Instead, he shows something truer, that growth means learning how to carry damage without letting it dictate every decision. This is why David Copperfield feels so real. It does not promise transformation through forgetting. It offers integration through understanding. And in doing so, Dickens anticipates a modern psychological truth. We are shaped by what happens to us, but not condemned by it. One of the quiet conclusions of David Copperfield is that identity is not inherited. It is assembled. David doesn't receive a stable self from family, class, or institution. He earns it slowly, through observation, error, reflection, and endurance. Every loss removes an illusion. Every mistake sharpens understanding. Dickens contrasts this with the idea that identity arrives through position or approval. David's growth does not come from status, money, or recognition. It comes from learning how to live with uncertainty without being ruled by it. This is why the novel feels expansive rather than triumphant. There is no final victory that resolves everything. Instead, there is something more believable. A man who understands himself well enough to move forward without needing constant reassurance. Dickens's claim is simple and demanding. Becoming oneself is not a gift society hands out. It is work done over time, often in private, often through pain. David Copperfield is remembered because it tells the truth about becoming a person, not as a single transformation, not as a moral lesson, but as a lifelong process shaped by memory. This is Dickens at his most humane. He does not condemn weakness. He does not glamorize suffering. He simply shows how a life is formed, unevenly, imperfectly, but honestly. If Oliver Twist accuses society, David Copperfield explains the cost of surviving it. The novel stands as Dickens's most personal work because it understands something enduring, that people are not defined by what happens to them, but by how they come to understand it. That is why this book lasts. It offers no fantasy of being untouched by damage. Only the quieter, harder hope of becoming whole despite it. Chapter 6. Great Expectations. The Illusion of Making It. Pip begins life small. He is an orphan, raised by his sister and her husband in a quiet, rural setting, far from wealth or status. His world is narrow, predictable, and defined by labor. There is nothing especially cruel about it, but there is nothing expansive either. Pip's dissatisfaction does not begin with ambition. It begins with awareness. Through a series of encounters, particularly with people who live above his station, Pip becomes conscious of what he lacks. He notices his speech, his manners, his clothes. He begins to see himself as unfinished. This is crucial. Pip does not want money because he loves luxury. He wants it because he has learned to feel less than. Shame enters quietly. He starts to judge his origins as embarrassing. Familiarity becomes something to escape. Loyalty begins to feel limiting. Dickens is precise here. Pip's ambition is not greed, it is self-rejection, the seed of the novel is planted the moment Pip internalizes the idea that who he is and where he comes from is not enough. Then the promise arrives. Pip is informed that he has come into money, not gradually, not through work, but suddenly, mysteriously, and without explanation. He is told that his future will be funded, and that his life will change. London becomes the destination. Gentility becomes the goal. Reinvention feels possible. Pip believes, as many do, that money will complete the story, that once circumstances change, the discomfort inside him will dissolve, that wealth will act as a kind of rebirth. Dickens frames this moment carefully. The money is not earned, it is bestowed. Pip does not know where it comes from, and he does not ask too many questions. What matters to him is what it promises: distance from his past, elevation in the eyes of others, and relief from the shame he now carries. This is the illusion at the heart of the novel. Pip mistakes transformation for healing. He believes that becoming someone else will finally make him whole. And Dickens lets him believe it, for a while. As Pip settles into his new life, something shifts inside him, and it is not confidence, it is shame. The more he imagines his future, the more uncomfortable his past becomes. The people who raised him now feel coarse. His home feels small. The work he once accepted without question now feels like evidence against him. This shame is not imposed from the outside. It is internal. Pip begins to measure himself constantly, his speech, his manners, his reactions, against an imagined standard of refinement. He does not yet belong to the world he wants to enter, but he no longer feels at ease in the world he came from. This in-between state is painful. Dickens is precise about what's happening here. Pip is not simply ambitious. He is learning to reject himself in advance, hoping that future success will retroactively justify that rejection. The tragedy is subtle. Pip does not hate where he came from. He fears being seen there. And once shame takes root, it begins to quietly reorganize loyalty, affection, and memory itself. As Pip moves deeper into the world of gentility, he begins to notice something unsettling. Class is not innate, it is performed. The rules are unwritten but strict: how to speak, how to dress, how to react without revealing too much. Pip studies these cues carefully, imitating them the way an actor learns a role. What surprises him, and the reader, is how hollow the performance feels. Dickens exposes gentility as a set of habits mistaken for virtue. Refinement does not necessarily signal kindness. Education does not guarantee wisdom. Politeness often conceals indifference. Pip learns to behave correctly while feeling increasingly disconnected. This is where the novel's critique sharpens. Dickens shows how social mobility often requires emotional disguise. To rise, Pip must hide parts of himself, his gratitude, his warmth, his loyalty, that do not fit the role he's trying to play. Class in this world is not about character. It is about convincing others, and eventually yourself, that you belong. And that performance comes at a cost. Once Pip leaves for London, the distance becomes real. He does not simply change location, he changes rhythm, language, and priorities. Letters replace conversations. Familiar faces become reminders of a past he is trying to outgrow. The people who once grounded him now make him uncomfortable. Joe, the brother-in-law who raised him with quiet loyalty, feels out of place in Pip's new world. Pip begins to notice Joe's rough manners, his simplicity, his lack of polish, and instead of feeling gratitude, he feels embarrassment. This is one of the novel's most painful movements. Dickens shows how success often demands emotional distance. Pip does not become cruel overnight. He becomes absent. He delays visits. He shortens letters. He tells himself that separation is temporary, even as it becomes permanent. What Pip gains in refinement, he loses in warmth. And Dickens makes the cost unmistakable. The higher Pip climbs socially, the more isolated he becomes emotionally. Success begins to look like solitude. For much of the novel, Pip believes his transformation is guided by destiny. He assumes, without confirmation, that his benefactor represents acceptance into a higher world. He builds fantasies around this assumption, allowing it to justify his shame and distance from the past. Then the truth arrives. Pip's money does not come from refinement, inheritance, or social approval. It comes from a man society has rejected, a criminal Pip once helped as a frightened child. The revelation is devastating. Everything Pip thought the money meant collapses. His rise was not an endorsement of his worth. His gentility was not recognized virtue. His transformation was funded by someone he had been taught to look down on. Dickens is ruthless here. The money Pip believed would cleanse his identity instead exposes it. It forces him to confront the lie at the heart of his ambition, that status equals moral elevation. In a single moment, success loses its meaning, and Pip is left face to face with himself, without illusion. After the truth is revealed, something becomes unmistakable. The money didn't fix Pip. Even at the height of his expectations, wealth, education, access to high society, the discomfort inside him never disappeared. It merely changed its language. Shame did not vanish. It became more refined. Anxiety didn't leave. It became quieter and harder to name. Dickens is making a precise psychological argument. Ambition is often mistaken for healing. People believe that if they can just reach a certain level, earn enough, be accepted, escape their origins, the unease inside them will dissolve. Pip proves the opposite. Because his ambition was built on self-rejection, success only deepened the fracture. The more he became what he thought he should be, the further he drifted from who he actually was. This is the novel's hardest truth. You cannot outrun an identity wound by upgrading your circumstances. If the desire to make it begins in shame, success will never feel like relief, only like distance. Pip's growth does not come through punishment or reward. It comes through reckoning. He does not undo his past behavior. He cannot reclaim the warmth he neglected or erase the pride that isolated him. What he gains instead is clarity, the ability to see himself honestly without the fantasy of transformation. Dickens refuses a clean redemption arc. Pip does not suddenly become pure or wise. He becomes accountable. He recognizes the people he diminished. He understands the cost of his ambition, and crucially, he learns that dignity is not something conferred by society. It is sustained through loyalty, humility, and care, qualities Pip once overlooked because they did not look like success. This is why the novel's ending feels sober rather than triumphant. Growth, Dickens suggests, does not mean becoming someone else. It means returning with open eyes to what mattered all along. Great Expectations is remembered because it tells an uncomfortable truth about success. It does not deny ambition. It does not condemn aspiration. It simply asks what ambition is trying to heal. Dickens shows a young man who gets what he thought he wanted: money, status, distance from his origins, and discovers that none of it resolves the unease that drove him there. The novel's power lies in this exposure. Pip's failure is not moral collapse. It is misdiagnosis. He believed his problem was circumstance when it was identity. He believed success would make him whole when what he needed was self-acceptance and loyalty to what grounded him. That is why the book still resonates. It speaks to anyone who has chased transformation through achievement and found the feeling unchanged. Anyone who has upgraded their life only to discover the inner fracture remained. Great Expectations endures because it names a modern illusion with rare clarity, that becoming more will finally make us enough. And it leaves us with a quieter, harder insight. Healing begins not with assent, but with understanding. Chapter 7: Wealth, Shame, and the Psychology of Status. Before money becomes a number, it is a signal. Status tells us where we belong, how we are seen, and whether we feel safe among others. Long before modern capitalism, humans learned that position meant protection, and exclusion meant danger. Dickens understood this instinct deeply. His characters rarely chase wealth for pleasure alone. They chase it because status promises relief from judgment, invisibility, and vulnerability. Pip doesn't want luxury. He wants to stop feeling small. Status offers a seductive shortcut. It suggests that if the outside changes, the inside will follow. That respect can be purchased, that confidence can be inherited. But Dickens shows something more uncomfortable. Status does not create security. It temporarily distracts from insecurity. The chase itself becomes the proof. Once status is pursued as protection, it never feels sufficient. There is always a higher tier, a finer distinction, a subtler judgment, and the ladder never ends. Shame is the engine beneath ambition, not guilt, shame. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am something wrong. Dickens's most ambitious characters are rarely driven by greed. They are driven by the fear of being seen as inadequate, crude, or disposable. Pip's rise begins the moment he internalizes that his origins make him unworthy of respect. This is why shame is such an effective motivator. It does not demand pleasure. It demands escape. It whispers that success will finally silence the internal accusation. But Dickens exposes the trap. Shame does not disappear with achievement. It relocates. It finds new standards, new comparisons, new ways to accuse. A society built on shame produces endless striving and very little peace. And Dickens shows us the cost long before psychology gave it a name. Money in Dickens' world is never the cure. It is the test. When characters receive wealth, it does not resolve their conflicts, it reveals them. Some become generous, some become blind, some become anxious, some become cruel. The difference is never the money itself. It is what the person believes the money is for. Pip believes money will rewrite his identity. David Copperfield never trusts it to do so. Scrooge uses it to insulate himself from feeling. Dickens is consistent. Money magnifies what already exists. It gives form to fear, not freedom from it. This is why wealth so often disappoints. It solves logistical problems while leaving emotional ones untouched. Money can change circumstances. It cannot answer the question of worth. One of Dickens's sharpest insights is the confusion between being seen and being valued. Status increases visibility. Worth requires recognition. In Great Expectations, Pip becomes more visible as he rises, more watched, more judged, more measured, but not more understood. Dickens shows how public validation can coexist with private emptiness. Applause does not equal connection. Attention does not equal care. This distinction matters deeply in modern life. Being noticed feels like being valued, but visibility often demands performance, not authenticity. It rewards what can be displayed, not what sustains. Dickens reminds us that worth is quieter than status. It shows itself in loyalty, consistency, and how people are treated when nothing is gained in return, and it cannot be scaled. If Dickens were writing today, his characters would not look out of place. They would be chasing titles, platforms, metrics, and milestones. They would be told that exhaustion is ambition, and that rest is laziness. Hustle culture promises transcendence through productivity, the same promise Pip believed in, updated for a digital age. Work harder, become more, escape who you were. Dickens would recognize the psychology instantly. When achievement becomes identity, failure feels like erasure. When worth is conditional, rest becomes terrifying. And when success is framed as moral proof, those who struggle are quietly blamed. Dickens' warning survives the century. A culture that ties dignity to output will never run out of exhausted people trying to earn permission to exist. Climbing always costs something. Dickens does not deny that status changes lives. It opens doors, it reduces vulnerability, it creates comfort, but it also extracts payment. Time, connection, ease. As people rise, they often lose touch with what once grounded them. Familiar relationships become awkward. Simplicity begins to feel unsafe. Stillness feels like regression. The tragedy Dickens returns to again and again is not failure. It is success achieved at the expense of belonging. When the climb is motivated by shame, the summit never feels stable. There is always someone above. Always something to prove. This chapter exists to make one thing clear. Status can change how you are treated, but it cannot tell you who you are. And when identity is built on assent alone, peace is always postponed. Chapter 8, A Christmas Carol, Wealth, Time, and Moral Awakening. Ebenezer Scrooge is introduced not through action, but through atmosphere. He is wealthy, successful, and respected in the narrow sense that matters to business. He owns property, he controls money, he understands contracts, ledgers, and profit. By every external measure, he has made it. And yet, his life is cold. Scrooge lives alone. He eats alone. He works in silence. He avoids generosity, not because he cannot afford it, but because he sees it as irrational. Dickens is careful to show that Scrooge is not poor in money. He is poor in connection. He has organized his entire life around control. No dependence, no obligations, no emotional risk. This is what Scrooge represents. He is the logical endpoint of a worldview that values efficiency over empathy and calculation over care. He believes that if he has met his legal obligations, he owes nothing further to anyone. Dickens does not frame Scrooge as a monster. He frames him as a man who has mistaken financial success for moral sufficiency. Scrooge's isolation is not accidental. It is deliberate. Over time, he has learned that closeness brings loss, that affection creates vulnerability, that caring makes him exposed to disappointment, grief, and obligation. So he chooses distance instead. Scrooge builds his life like a fortress. The fewer emotional ties he has, the fewer demands can be placed upon him. The less he feels, the less he can be hurt. Dickens shows this not as cruelty, but as defense. The problem is the cost. Isolation doesn't simply remove pain, it removes joy, warmth, and meaning. Scrooge survives, but he doesn't live. Time passes, but nothing accumulates except habit and resentment. This is why A Christmas Carol begins where it does. Before ghosts appear, before judgment arrives, Dickens wants us to understand that Scrooge's greatest loss is not moral, it is human. He has made safety his highest value, and it has left him alone. When the first spirit appears, it doesn't accuse Scrooge, it remembers him. Scrooge is taken backward through his own life, to moments he has not revisited in years. Scenes of childhood loneliness, early hopes, lost tenderness, the quiet turning points where he chose security over closeness. These memories are not shown to shame him. They are shown to measure him. Dickens uses memory as a form of moral evidence, not what Scrooge tells himself he is, but what his life reveals he became. Each remembered moment exposes a trade-off. Every emotional withdrawal had a reason. Every hardening began as protection. What unsettles Scrooge most is not guilt, but recognition. He sees that his present coldness did not appear suddenly. It was assembled, choice by choice, over time. This is Dickens's insight. Judgment does not require condemnation. It requires clarity. And once Scrooge can see his past honestly, distance from it becomes impossible. If the past shows how Scrooge became who he is, the present shows what that life costs others. The second spirit reveals the world as it exists now, shaped by Scrooge's choices, not through dramatic cruelty, but through absence. Missed kindness, withheld generosity, emotional distance that ripples outward. Dickens focuses on ordinary suffering, families struggling, workers enduring hardship, small joys that could have been eased, but weren't. Scrooge begins to understand something devastating. He has not merely protected himself, he has participated in harm through indifference. The present becomes unavoidable evidence. Scrooge sees that legality is not morality, and that meeting minimal obligations does not absolve responsibility. The consequences of his isolation are no longer abstract. They have faces, voices, names. Dickens' point is sharp but restrained. What we choose not to do can matter as much as what we actively do. And once Scrooge sees the human cost of his detachment, neutrality becomes impossible. The final vision does not revisit memory, it removes certainty. Scrooge is shown the future, not as prophecy, but as consequence. A world where he is gone, and life has simply moved on without him. There is no mourning, no gratitude, no warmth attached to his absence. People speak of him casually, even lightly. His death is an inconvenience, not a loss. The life he built around self-protection leaves no emotional trace. Dickens is ruthless here. The future reveals the final cost of isolation, to live in a way that makes no one feel your absence. Scrooge is forced to confront what his trajectory leads to if nothing changes. Not punishment, erasure. This is not about fear of death. It is about fear of a life that never truly connected with another human being. Time, at last, becomes undeniable accountability. Scrooge does not change because he is frightened. He changes because he finally understands. The journey through time gives him something he never allowed himself before: perspective. He sees how his fear shaped his habits, how his habits hardened into character, and how that character isolated him from everything that once mattered. Dickens is careful here. The awakening is not sentimental. Scrooge does not suddenly become virtuous. He becomes aware, and awareness is enough. Once Scrooge truly sees the cost of his choices, not just to himself, but to others, he no longer needs coercion. Change becomes urgent, not imposed. This is Dickens's core belief. Moral transformation does not begin with punishment or shame. It begins the moment someone can no longer pretend they do not see. And once Scrooge sees clearly, he moves quickly while there is still time. Scrooge's redemption does not erase his past. That is the point. He does not undo the years of coldness, the missed kindnesses, or the relationships he allowed to wither. Dickens refuses the fantasy of a clean slate. What has been done remains done, but response is still possible. Scrooge's change is immediate, not because it is magical, but because it is grounded in clarity. He understands that while the past cannot be corrected, the present can still be inhabited differently. He acts generously, openly, without calculation, not to compensate, but to live otherwise. This distinction matters. Dickens is not preaching perfection. He is defending responsibility. Redemption, here, is not about becoming innocent. It is about becoming engaged. Scrooge steps back into human relationship with full knowledge of who he has been, and chooses connection anyway. A Christmas Carol endures because it makes a daring claim that it is not too late. Dickens does not promise endless time. He insists on urgency. The story matters because Scrooge is shown the truth before life is finished, not after. Change is possible, but it is not guaranteed. This is why the book has survived every era. It does not flatter the reader. It confronts them. It asks whether awareness will be delayed until consequence makes it meaningless. Dickens' belief is firm and unsentimental. People can change, but only once they truly see, and only while there is still time to act. That is why A Christmas Carol is not a story about Christmas. It is a story about time, and the moment you realize you are still inside it. Chapter 9, Bleak House, When Systems Replace Humanity. Bleak House begins not with a character, but with a lawsuit. The case is called Jarndyce and Jarndyce, and it concerns a disputed inheritance tangled in legal arguments so complex that no one fully understands them anymore. The case has been running for generations. Lawyers have grown old inside it. Families have been formed and destroyed by it. What matters is not the money, but the delay. The lawsuit has become self-perpetuating. It continues because it exists. Documents multiply. Procedures expand. Every attempt to resolve it generates more work, more expense, more postponement. Dickens presents this immediately as a warning. The legal system is no longer serving justice. It is serving itself. From the opening pages, Dickens makes clear that Bleak House is not about corruption in the dramatic sense. There is no villain pulling strings. Instead, there is a machine that keeps running long after it has forgotten its purpose. The case does not ruin lives through cruelty. It ruins them through endless postponement. Around this case, lives begin to stall. Characters wait for decisions that never arrive. They delay plans, relationships, and futures, believing resolution is just around the corner. Time passes quietly, then suddenly, irreversibly. Dickens shows people organizing their entire existence around process. They do not live, they wait. Hope becomes suspended animation. Ambition is deferred. Identity itself becomes provisional, dependent on paperwork and rulings that are always pending. What makes this devastating is that no one tells them to stop living. No one forbids happiness. The system simply absorbs attention so completely that life shrinks around it. Years are lost, not to tragedy, but to procedure. Dickens is careful here. The harm is subtle. No single moment feels catastrophic. But when looked at as a whole, something chilling emerges. A world where time is quietly taken from people who trust the system to eventually make things right. And it never does. In Bleak House, no one wakes up intending to destroy a life. That is what makes the damage so disturbing. The lawyers involved in Jarndyce and Jarndyce follow procedure. Clerks copy documents. Judges defer decisions. Each individual action appears reasonable, even responsible. But taken together, they create something Dickens recognizes as deeply violent. Not explosive violence, but erosion. People lose money through fees. They lose clarity through complexity. Most of all, they lose time. Years spent waiting for a resolution that is always postponed. Dickens grounds this harm in characters who age, decay, and disappear inside the process. Some grow obsessed, some grow numb, some die before the case concludes, leaving nothing but paperwork behind them. This is the novel's crucial move. Dickens shows that systems do not need malice to destroy. They only need momentum and distance. When harm is spread thinly across many hands, no one feels responsible, and so it continues uninterrupted. The violence of bureaucracy is that it destroys lives while appearing neutral. And neutrality, Dickens suggests, can be lethal. What Jarndyce and Jarndyce ultimately consumes is not money. It consumes time. Characters in Bleak House postpone their futures, believing that once the case resolves, life can finally begin. They delay marriages, careers, and decisions. They live in anticipation rather than presence. Years pass. Dickens makes this theft painfully visible by showing the physical effects of waiting. Hope curdles into fixation. Energy drains away. People become smaller versions of themselves, organized around documents and deadlines that never deliver. The tragedy is not sudden loss. It is slow subtraction. No one seizes time violently. It is surrendered, increment by increment, to a system that promises eventual justice but never arrives at it. Dickens's insight here is devastatingly modern. When systems delay endlessly, they steal the one resource that cannot be returned. Not wealth, not status, but the years in which a life could have been lived. And when the case finally collapses under its own weight, there is nothing left to recover. One of the most unsettling features of Bleak House is that no one can be clearly blamed. Each participant in Jarndyce and Jarndyce points elsewhere. Lawyers cite precedent. Clerks follow instructions. Judges defer to process. Everyone is involved, and yet no one feels responsible for the outcome. Dickens illustrates this through characters who sincerely believe they are doing their jobs. They are not cruel. They are not corrupt. They are compliant. And compliance is enough. As responsibility spreads outward, accountability evaporates. Harm becomes abstract. Suffering is reframed as unfortunate but inevitable. The system absorbs guilt by distributing it so thinly that no single conscience feels its weight. This is Dickens's warning. When responsibility is diluted across institutions, moral action becomes optional. People learn to care about correctness rather than consequence. They ask whether rules were followed, not whether lives were damaged. In Bleak House, injustice survives, not because people are evil, but because no one feels personally answerable. And that, Dickens suggests, is how harm becomes permanent. As the case drags on, something changes inside the people bound to it. They stop feeling. Hope hardens into obsession. Disappointment dulls into routine. Suffering becomes familiar enough to ignore. Characters speak of ruin calmly, as if it were weather. This emotional flattening is one of the novel's most chilling effects. Dickens shows how prolonged exposure to injustice numbs empathy. When delay becomes normal, outrage fades. When loss is constant, grief is postponed indefinitely. People learn how to endure, but not how to live. The system does not only steal time, it reshapes inner life. By the time outcomes arrive, if they arrive at all, many characters no longer have the emotional capacity to care. Damage has already settled into personality. This is the final cruelty of procedural harm. It does not just destroy circumstances, it erodes the human response to destruction itself. And once numbness sets in, injustice no longer needs defense. It simply continues. By the end of Bleak House, Dickens makes something unmistakably clear. The system does not care. Jarndyce and Jarndyce eventually collapses under its own weight. After years of litigation, delays, and expense, the estate is consumed almost entirely by legal fees. There is nothing left to inherit. The case ends not with justice, but with exhaustion. No one celebrates. No one is held accountable. The machinery simply stops because there is nothing left to process. Dickens uses this ending deliberately. He wants the reader to feel the emptiness of a system that followed every rule and achieved nothing humane. Institutions, Dickens shows, can function perfectly and still fail morally. They can obey procedure while abandoning purpose. They can endure without conscience. This is why systems are so dangerous when they lose their human center. They do not feel urgency. They do not feel loss. They do not feel shame. And so they persist long after the people they were meant to serve have been worn down or erased. Bleak House feels modern because its danger is familiar. Not tyrants, not villains, but complexity, delay, and institutional inertia. Dickens anticipates a world where harm is hidden inside process, where responsibility is buried in departments, where suffering is real but no one can quite point to who caused it. This is why readers today recognize the novel instantly. Endless forms, deferred decisions, appeals without resolution. Dickens understood something we still struggle with, that systems grow faster than moral oversight. And once they do, human consequences become secondary to operational continuity. The novel does not argue for chaos or rule-breaking. It argues for conscience inside structure. Without it, order becomes cruelty by another name. And that is why Bleak House feels less like a historical critique and more like a warning we failed to take seriously. Bleak House is remembered because it proves a disturbing truth, that systems can destroy lives without malice. Dickens does not accuse individuals of evil. He accuses arrangements. He shows how delay becomes damage, how neutrality becomes complicity, and how responsibility disappears when it is spread too thin. The novel's power lies in its refusal to offer a villain to defeat. There is no final confrontation, no moral catharsis, only the quiet devastation of lives paused, depleted, and forgotten. That is why Bleak House endures. It teaches that injustice does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives politely, dressed as procedure, asking for patience. And it asks a final question that still haunts modern life. When harm is produced by systems rather than people, who is brave enough to interrupt it? Chapter 10. Hard Times. Life reduced to numbers. Hard Times opens in a schoolroom. At the front stands Thomas Gradgrind, a man convinced that the world can be improved by removing everything vague, emotional, or imaginative from it. He addresses a room full of children as if they are empty containers, waiting to be filled. His instruction is absolute. Teach nothing but facts. No stories, no wonder, no speculation. Children are not asked who they are or what they feel. They are asked to define, classify, and recite. A horse is not something to imagine riding. It is an object to be described by measurable properties. Dickens makes this scene uncomfortably concrete. We see the children hesitate, shrink, and learn quickly what kind of thinking is rewarded. Curiosity is corrected. Creativity is discouraged. Accuracy becomes virtue. Gradgrind believes he is doing good. He is not cruel. He is sincere. That is what makes him dangerous. This classroom is not simply a place of learning. It is a factory for a certain kind of person. One trained to function, calculate and obey, but never to question what life is for. One of the children in Gradgrind's classroom is his own daughter, Louisa. We follow her out of the schoolroom and into adulthood, and this is where Hard Times reveals its human cost. Louisa grows up disciplined, obedient, and emotionally untrained. She learns how to reason, calculate, and suppress. What she never learns is how to name her feelings or trust them. Dickens shows this quietly. Louisa doesn't rebel. She complies. When she becomes a young woman, she is encouraged into a marriage based not on affection, but on logic. The match makes sense on paper. It promises stability, advantage, and respectability, and it leaves her empty. Louisa cannot explain her unhappiness because she was never taught to recognize it. She experiences longing as confusion and dissatisfaction as personal failure. This is Dickens' point made flesh. An education that denies imagination doesn't remove emotion. It leaves people unequipped to understand it. Louisa becomes the embodiment of a system that prized facts so highly it forgot to teach what a human life feels like from the inside. If Louisa shows the emotional cost of this worldview at the top of society, Stephen Blackpool shows it at the bottom. Stephen is a factory worker, honest, exhausted, and trapped. His life is governed by schedules, wages, and rules he did not design and cannot escape. He is treated not as a person, but as a unit of labor, replaceable, measurable, useful only so long as he produces. Dickens is careful here. Stephen is not portrayed as ignorant or lazy. He is thoughtful, moral, and painfully aware of the injustice around him, and of his own powerlessness within it. When Stephen seeks relief from an impossible personal situation, the system offers him no human answer, only procedure. Rules are cited, forms are invoked, sympathy is absent. Through Stephen, Dickens makes the critique unmistakable. When people are reduced to numbers, suffering becomes invisible. And when suffering is invisible, it is easily ignored. Stephen is not crushed by cruelty. He is crushed by indifference, organized as efficiency. What links Louisa Gradgrind and Stephen Blackpool is not circumstance, but deprivation. Both are starved, not of food or work, but of emotional nourishment. Louisa lives in comfort, yet feels hollow. Stephen works himself to exhaustion, yet feels unseen. One is respected, the other ignored. And yet both suffer from the same absence, a world that does not recognize inner life as real. Dickens is deliberate in pairing them. Louisa's pain is quiet, internal, confusing. Stephen's pain is physical, relentless, and public, but neither has language for what they are missing, because the culture around them denies that such needs exist. Feelings are treated as inconveniences. Longing is dismissed as weakness. Compassion is regarded as inefficient. This is emotional starvation by design. Dickens' warning is subtle but severe. A society that refuses to acknowledge emotional reality does not eliminate suffering. It distributes it silently. And when people are denied the right to feel, They lose the ability to imagine alternatives. They endure, and that endurance slowly becomes despair. In hard times, a person's worth is measured by output. What can you produce? How efficiently? At what cost? Stephen's value ends the moment his usefulness is questioned. Louisa's marriage is justified by advantage, not affection. Even Gradgrind evaluates success in terms of results, not well-being. Identity collapses into function. Dickens shows how dangerous this reduction becomes. When productivity defines worth, rest feels like failure. When usefulness replaces dignity, people become disposable the moment they slow down. This logic infects everyone. Workers internalize guilt for exhaustion. Those in power mistake efficiency for virtue. And human complexity is flattened into metrics that can be managed but are never satisfied. Dickens is diagnosing something fundamental. When productivity becomes identity, people stop asking whether life is meaningful and start asking only whether it is justified. And that question has no human answer. Eventually, the system Dickens builds in hard times begins to fail its own people. Louisa reaches a breaking point. Having lived her life according to reason alone, she finds herself unable to explain why she is unhappy, only that she is. When her emotional world finally demands recognition, she has no language for it, no framework to understand it, and no support prepared to receive it. Stephen's collapse is quieter, but no less devastating. His honesty isolates him. His refusal to conform makes him expendable. The system that demanded his productivity offers no protection once he no longer fits neatly inside it. Dickens is showing consequence now, not theory. When imagination is suppressed, people cannot envision change. When emotion is denied, suffering becomes private and unbearable. When worth is tied only to function, failure becomes existential. Meaning collapses, not because people stop working, but because they no longer understand why they are working. And without meaning, endurance turns into despair. By the end of hard times, Dickens' verdict is unmistakable. Reason alone is not enough. A society built only on facts may function, but it cannot flourish. Calculation can organize labor, but it cannot sustain a life. Efficiency can optimize systems, but it cannot explain why anyone should care. Dickens does not reject reason. He rejects reason without imagination, structure without empathy, and intelligence without moral depth. Through Gradgrind, Louisa, and Stephen, Dickens shows that when human complexity is reduced to numbers, everyone loses. The powerful become blind, and the vulnerable become invisible. This is why hard times matters. It exposes the belief that if something can be measured, it must be meaningful. And if it cannot, it must be ignored. Dickens's final warning is quiet, but firm. A world that understands everything except the human heart will eventually understand nothing that truly matters. Chapter 11. Dickens versus the modern world. Why the human condition never changes. Dickens wrote about factories, workhouses, and clerks bent over ledgers. We write about deadlines, inboxes, and productivity apps. The surface has changed. The pressure has not. In Dickens' time, exhaustion came from physical labor. Today, it comes from cognitive overload, always on, always reachable, always behind. The language has softened, but the demand remains the same. Produce more, rest less, justify your existence through output. Dickens would recognize this instantly. He understood societies that confuse effort with worth and mistake exhaustion for virtue. Hustle culture is not new. It is hard times with better branding. In Dickens' world, worth was measured by class and income. In ours, it is measured by visibility. Followers, metrics, engagement, rankings. Algorithms decide who is seen, who is amplified, and who disappears. Value is assigned numerically, impersonally, and constantly. This is Great Expectations rewritten in code. People learn quickly what is rewarded. They shape themselves accordingly. They perform versions of themselves that travel well, even when those versions feel hollow. Dickens warned that when society mistakes measurement for meaning, people begin to live for approval rather than truth. Algorithmic worth doesn't ask who you are. It asks how you perform. And that question quietly reshapes identity. One of the most unsettling shifts in modern life is that burnout is no longer a warning sign. It is an expectation. People apologize for being tired, not for being overworked. Exhaustion is reframed as ambition. Collapse is treated as a personal failure rather than a systemic outcome. Dickens wrote entire novels about this dynamic. Stephen Blackpool breaks under relentless labor. Louisa Gradgrind empties out emotionally. Clerks, children, and workers endure until endurance becomes identity. The modern world did not invent burnout. It normalized it. And Dickens's insight still applies. When suffering becomes routine, it stops being questioned and starts being internalized. People blame themselves for conditions that were never designed for human limits. Bleak House showed a system that destroyed lives without malice. We live inside dozens of them. Customer service loops, automated decisions, appeals that disappear into silence. Everyone follows procedure. No one takes responsibility. Modern institutions don't need cruelty to cause harm. They only need scale, distance, and time. Delay becomes policy. Neutrality becomes cover. Dickens understood this long before bureaucracy had a digital interface. He knew that when systems grow larger than conscience, human suffering becomes background noise. And once numbness sets in, injustice doesn't need justification. It simply persists. Dickens still hurts because he refuses to flatter us. He does not tell us we are uniquely enlightened. He does not suggest progress automatically brings wisdom. He shows patterns, and once you see them, you cannot unsee them. Ambition driven by shame. Systems divorced from humanity. Productivity mistaken for purpose. Like the Bible, like the Quran, Dickens is not valuable because of when it was written, but because of what it observes. The human condition. Fear. Longing. The need for dignity. The cost of ignoring it. His work endures because it does not depend on technology, politics, or trends. It depends on people being people, and that has not changed. This is the moment Dickens is waiting for. The moment when the reader stops saying, "That's how things were," and starts saying, "That's how people are." Because Dickens is powerful, not just because he tells stories, but because once you understand the human condition, you realize these are not stories at all. They are patterns. An unprotected child with no guidance does not become Oliver Twist once. He becomes a statistic. In Nigerian slums, Brazilian favelas, American ghettos, anywhere society leaves children exposed. Crime follows neglect as predictably as hunger follows famine. A woman trapped in a rational, loveless marriage is not unique to hard times. She exists wherever emotional needs are dismissed as impractical. A worker reduced to output is not Victorian. He is modern, exhausted, and everywhere. And Pip's mistake, believing that climbing the social ladder will finally make him belong, is one of the most common illusions of all. You rise and discover another room, another code, another level you were never trained for. You can live well and still feel out of place. You can make it and still not belong, because there is always another table you weren't invited to. This is why Dickens endures. Not because the stories are dramatic, but because they describe outcomes that repeat wherever humans organize themselves. Once you see that, the books stop being literature. They become mirrors. And the final recognition lands quietly but permanently. Dickens still speaks clearly today. Not because the world failed to change, but because the human condition never has. Chapter 12. What Dickens believed a good society looked like. Dickens did not oppose organization, structure, or progress. He opposed efficiency when it replaced care. Across his novels, the most damaging systems are not chaotic. They are well run. Workhouses function smoothly. Courts process cases diligently. Factories operate on schedule. What they lack is compassion. Dickens believed a good society must slow down when a human being is harmed by speed, that procedures should bend when people break, that efficiency is a tool, not a virtue. In his world, moral failure begins the moment suffering is dismissed as an acceptable byproduct of smooth operation. A good society, Dickens implies, does not ask, "Is this efficient?" It asks, "Is anyone being crushed by this?" And if the answer is yes, the system must change, not the person. Dickens never condemned wealth itself. He condemned what people used wealth to avoid. Scrooge is not criticized for having money. He is criticized for using it as insulation from obligation, empathy, and human contact. Dickens believed wealth amplified responsibility. The more power a person had, the greater their duty to notice, to act, and to care. Money, in Dickens' world, is not a moral reward. It is a moral test. It reveals whether someone uses comfort to withdraw or to extend security outward. A good society, Dickens suggests, does not glorify accumulation. It asks a harder question. What does your advantage obligate you to do for others? Dickens did not hate institutions. He feared them. He understood that institutions tend to forget why they were created. Courts begin to serve procedure. Schools begin to serve ideology. Bureaucracies begin to serve themselves. And when that happens, people become secondary. Dickens believed institutions should remain visibly accountable to human outcomes. They should be interruptible, questionable, responsive. The moment an institution becomes untouchable, it becomes dangerous. A good society, in Dickens' vision, keeps systems close to the people they affect. It does not hide harm behind complexity or delay. Institutions exist to serve human life, never the other way around. Dickens was not nostalgic. He did not want to return to the past. But he was deeply suspicious of progress that measured itself only in output, growth, or scale. Factories could expand while lives contracted. Cities could grow richer while people grew lonelier. Dickens believed material progress without moral progress was hollow and ultimately destructive. A society that advances technologically but regresses ethically does not evolve. It displaces harm. In Dickens' worldview, true progress meant that prosperity should reduce suffering, not simply rearrange it. If advancement leaves the vulnerable untouched, or worse, invisible, it is not progress at all. One of Dickens's strongest convictions was simple: suffering must be seen. Oliver exists because Dickens refused to let neglected children remain abstract. Stephen Blackpool exists because workers were being discussed, but not understood. Louisa exists because emotional damage was being ignored. Dickens believed a good society does not hide its most vulnerable behind statistics or euphemisms. It places them at the center of its moral attention. If suffering is invisible, it becomes tolerable. If it is visible, it demands response. This is why Dickens wrote novels instead of essays. He wanted people to be seen, and therefore impossible to ignore. Dickens did not believe humans were meant to endure life alone. Isolation, in his novels, is never strength. It is always a warning sign. Whether it is Scrooge's solitude, Pip's social estrangement, or Louisa's emotional confinement, separation corrodes meaning. Dickens believed dignity is sustained through relationship, through being known, needed, and connected. A good society, then, does not simply protect individuals. It cultivates community, places where people matter beyond their usefulness, where care is reciprocal, where worth is not constantly measured. For Dickens, community was not sentimental. It was survival. Dickens never described a perfect society, and that was intentional. He did not believe utopia could be designed in advance. He believed it had to be practiced moment by moment through attention, responsibility, and restraint. His ideal society is implied, not declared. It is one where systems pause for people, where wealth notices need, where progress includes conscience. Dickens trusted readers to complete the picture themselves, because a good society, in his view, is not built by blueprints, but by ordinary people refusing to look away. This is where his work finally leaves literature behind. It does not tell us what to build. It asks us what we are willing to notice, and what we are willing to change once we do. Chapter 13. The warning Dickens left us. Societies do not reject Dickens because he is wrong. They reject him because he is accurate. Dickens does not offer escape. He offers reflection. He shows people what their systems produce, what their values reward, and who gets left behind when comfort becomes priority. That kind of clarity is unsettling. Mirrors are rarely welcomed. They do not flatter. They do not reassure. They show consequences, often before people are ready to face them. Dickens' work survives, not because it soothes, but because it exposes. Every era that rediscovers Dickens does so reluctantly, usually after damage has already been done. Not because the warning was unclear, but because it was inconvenient. And inconvenient truths are the easiest to ignore. Most societies prefer stories that comfort rather than confront. Narratives that celebrate progress without asking who paid for it. Stories that frame success as proof of virtue and failure as personal weakness. Dickens refuses this bargain. He shows success built on neglect, order maintained through indifference, respectability coexisting comfortably with cruelty. This is why his work often feels heavy. It interrupts the desire to feel good about how things are. Comfort tells us everything is fine. Truth asks who is suffering quietly. Dickens understood that societies rarely collapse because they lack intelligence or innovation. They collapse because they prioritize reassurance over honesty. Moral critique is always threatening to those who benefit from the system. Dickens never attacks individuals in isolation. He questions arrangements, and that is far more dangerous. When suffering is described as structural, comfort becomes conditional, advantage becomes accountable, neutrality becomes impossible. This is why Dickens is often described as pessimistic, sentimental, or outdated. These labels soften the discomfort of being questioned. To accept Dickens fully would require admitting that prosperity can coexist with injustice, and that benefiting from a system does not make one innocent of its effects. That is not a message power welcomes. Every generation believes it is seeing these problems for the first time. And every generation is wrong. Dickens keeps returning because societies forget the same lessons repeatedly. The names change, the technology advances, the structures grow more complex, but the outcomes remain familiar. We forget what neglect produces. We forget what unchecked systems do. We forget the cost of treating people as abstractions. Only after consequences become visible do we reach back, rediscovering Dickens as if he were newly relevant rather than perpetually ignored. This is not rediscovery. It is delayed recognition. Dickens never opposed progress. He opposed progress without conscience. He understood that societies can grow richer while becoming colder, that systems can become more efficient while becoming less humane, that wealth can expand even as meaning contracts. Progress that does not reduce suffering is not neutral, it is selective. Dickens' warning is simple and severe. When growth outpaces responsibility, harm does not disappear. It relocates, and the farther it is displaced from view, the easier it is to deny. Dickens does not chase us. He waits. His books remain where they have always been, describing what happens when neglect is normalized, when ambition outruns empathy, and when systems forget who they exist for. The warning does not expire. It does not demand belief. It only requires recognition. Every generation is given the same choice, to look into the mirror or to walk past it. That is the final truth Dickens leaves us with. Not a solution, not a prediction, but an open moment of responsibility. The mirror is still standing. Charles Dickens does not tell us what to do. He shows us what happens. And then he leaves the rest, deliberately, quietly, to us. Thank you for spending this time with the Infinite Archive. Charles Dickens did not offer easy answers. He offered clarity. He showed us what happens and trusted us to decide what to do once we see it. If this journey left you thinking, questioning, or recognizing something familiar, then it has done its work. If you'd like to continue exploring timeless ideas about human nature, society, and meaning, you're always welcome here. Until next time, read deeply, notice carefully, and don't look away.